I'll say in advance that, so we've kind of got two topics here because I think we actually interestingly disagree about both of them. One of them is there some important sense in which free will exists? And then the other one is, doesn't matter. Why is that important? Like what are the sort of moral or political consequences of that? And I think we have interesting disagreements about both of them. I think for myself, for this kind of opening, I am just going to stick to the first one, just because there's maybe so much to say about it that I think that if I just kind of do that, and then you can tell me why free will doesn't exist and why that's important, and then I can maybe try to fill in why I have a different perspective on the sort of moral or political fallout of it than you do.
Yeah, sounds
But
great.
okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll start off with that like that. So yeah, as I say, there are two questions. The title of the debate. I want to address them both in the order, but right now, just the first one, which I actually think might be, I think there might be a methodological upside to only having time for the first one right now, because I think one thing we could probably agree on is that there is something maybe analytically useful about separating these questions, right? That we don't want to say either it would really suck if there was no such thing as free will, therefore there is free will, or it would really suck if there were, therefore there isn't, right? In either case, that would be bad methodology. So let's just talk for now, at least for mine, about whether there is or isn't, and I think that might be useful to just start by talking about one important reason, not the only reason, but one important reason why many people think there isn't. So one important reason has to do with determinism about physical causation, which is the view that every physical event is caused by previous physical events plus, law-like regularities in the physical world. I always tell intro to philosophy students to think back to physics classes they might have taken in high school or earlier in college, where you might have got word problems about the baseball going at the bat at a certain speed and angle and all of that, and where it's going to end up. And the assumption is that if you have all the physical inputs, you can stick that in your equations and pop out the result. And causal determinism is the claim that everything is like that, that everything that ever happens is determined by sort of initial conditions plus physical laws. And of course, decision making in the human brain isn't going to be some sort of special magical exception to those general physical laws. So many people believe this is a view called incompatibilism, that if causal determinism is true, that means there just can't be such a thing as free will. So a completely deterministic universe is one where there's no room for autonomous human decision making. We're just kind of meat puppets being pulled around by invisible strings. Lots of people in the history of philosophy have held this position. Lots of people right now believe this, but not all incompatibilists are the same. Some of them believe that we are, in fact, living in a deterministic universe and therefore we don't have free will, while others believe that we aren't living in a deterministic universe and decision making in the human brain really is a mysterious, spooky exception to the general laws of physical cause and effect. So that's one kind of argument that people can have about the existence of free will. It's an argument about how physical reality works. Um, I should also add, just to be complete, that some people say free will doesn't exist, whether determinism is true or it's false, because the only way determinism can to any extent be false is if, to that extent, causation is just random, and determinism and randomness are equally bad for free will. So we don't have it either way. That's also a respectable position, although, as we'll see, not really one I hold. Another kind of argument that people can have about free will is an argument that's not about the nature of physical reality at all. It's really an argument about language, or maybe what philosophy nerds call conceptual analysis. So this one is an argument about what we mean when we say free will, or maybe what we mean when we use phrases like "you were free to do X," or "you could have done not X if you'd wanted to." And some people think that when we say one of those phrases, what we're claiming is that no physical law, even given all of the initial conditions, would have restrained you from doing whatever you're doing. Other people say, no, it doesn't have to be true that your action wasn't determined by physical laws at all for you to be acting freely, um, because that if you think about how we use words like can and could in ordinary language, I mean, think about if you're camping. I've got GA Cohen on the mind, so got camping examples, and a boulder rolls down to right next to your tent, and then you see it the next morning when you wake up, you might say that could have crushed us. You don't mean that it could have given its initial position and the angle at which it's rolling and the speed at which it's rolling, because given all that initial setup, no, it could not have crushed you. What you mean is maybe that we wouldn't have to change the conditions very much for it to have crushed you, or we mean that if it had, if it had started at a slightly different angle, nothing would have stopped it from crushing us, or something like that. And similarly, to bring it to human free will, if I got hit by a car and I'm still alive, but just barely, and Aaron sees me and shrugs and keeps walking, we could say that he could have helped me. And all that means is that if we kept everything about the situation the same, except for which decision he made, then he would have helped me. And that, according to another view, is what free will is. That's pretty much like David Hume's position, for example, about what free will is. Now, to put my cards on the table about these two debates, these two kinds of debates about whether we have free will, I think the first kind of argument is pretty uninteresting, since I just can't take seriously the idea that we have mysterious, spooky powers to override the laws of physics with our will. So if that's what free will means, I'm on Aaron's side of the argument, and I don't have much else to say about it. The second argument is a little bit more interesting, and I think that people with that kind of simple compatibilist position, that yeah, free will is compatible with determinism, because if we really look at what we mean by it, then I think that kind of position, I think they are being more reasonable than their critics sometimes give them credit for. Sometimes people who don't like that position accuse those simple compatibilists of just playing with words, or quote unquote changing the definition of free will. And I don't think those charges are quite fair. I think that compatibilists like that are actually putting their finger on something real about how words like could or can often work in ordinary language. And I'd be happy to get more into that later in the discussion. But I don't really want to linger on it, because I don't think the second way of debating free will is actually the most interesting or important debate we could have about free will either. The reason I don't think it's the most interesting or important one we could have is that it's the kind of debate that we could resolve just by clearing up how each of the two people are using the term. We could just call my sense of free will FWB for free will Ben, and Aaron's sense FWA for free will Aaron, and then we're not disagreed anymore. We could just agree that FWB exists and FWA doesn't exist, and the stream could end early, and we could just go have a beer or something. Where things become interesting again, to my mind, is when we ask a slightly different question, which is what kind of free will would have to make sense of some philosophically important and interesting concept, like, for example, moral responsibility. What kind of control does somebody have to have over their actions for it to make sense to say that what they did was their fault, or conversely, to make sense to say that what they did was to their credit, that it was praiseworthy? Well, what I was calling FWB earlier, and I really should have called maybe FWH for free will Hume, that kind of basic bitch compatibilism, is that you have free will as long as your decision, your preference, played the right role at a crucial link in the chain of cause and effect, and nothing would have stopped you from acting on a different decision if you made a different decision. And that is a kind of control that we definitely have, even in a worst case scenario version of determinism. But I think Aaron and I actually agree that FWH wouldn't be sufficient for moral responsibility or most other interesting and important concepts that might seem to be linked up with some kind of free will. So how about FWA, free will Aaron? Well, when he does his opening, he can correct me if I've misunderstood his position. But when he went on What's Left of Philosophy and said we don't have free will, what he seemed to mean, as far as I could tell, was that we don't have a kind of control over our actions. We'd only have if the chain of cause and effect leading us to act the way we didn't involve any element we don't have control over. His view seems to be a kind of view of free will where actions count as free if they're free of luck, like the way that Henry Hill in Goodfellas says he couldn't be a made man in the mob because the requirement was that they be able to trace all of his ancestors on both sides back to Italy and make sure there are no vendettas. On this view of free will, there can't be any taint of luck, any taint of anything outside our control in any of the ancestors of your decision in the whole chain of cause and effect leading up to it, or else it doesn't count. And I actually agree with Aaron that we don't have a FWA. Free will Aaron wouldn't be possible if determinism were true. In fact, I don't think it would be possible whether or not determinism was true, for kind of the reason that I gestured at earlier, that that there are also problems about randomness and all of that. Especially put the way that Aaron likes to put it in terms of luck. I think that makes that connection very clear. So um, In the what's left of philosophy discussion, Aaron seemed to dismiss FWH as mere causal influence, and then to say that that's not enough for responsibility. Fair enough. And then also very sensibly to say that FWA doesn't exist, and therefore to conclude that moral responsibility doesn't exist. And the point I really want to make here is that there are lots of kinds of control that are both stronger than FWH, but weaker than FWA. And my view is that all the sort of conceptual space of like interested and plausible compatibilisms are somewhere in between those two. And I think that some of the views in between those two some of the kinds of control that we could have that are more interesting than FWH, less demanding than FWA, I think some of those others are things that we clearly do have, even if we live in a completely deterministic universe. And I think it's plausible to say that one of the ones somewhere in those space is the one that matters for moral responsibility. The particular kind that I lean towards, so this would be the true FWB, free will Ben, is the kind outlined most famously by a philosopher named John Martin Fisher, and somewhat less famously by my good friend Ryan Lake. You can read his doctoral dissertation about it online. It's called No Fate But What We Make. And on that view, what matters is not that the process is luck-free at every ancestral link in the causal chain, but rather that it arises out of what those guys call a reasons-responsive mechanism. In other words, the relevant capacity is our ability to understand reasons for and against different courses of action, to weigh them against each other, to be at least somewhat moved by reasons for or against act in a certain way, which is of course a matter of degree, but that there's a threshold that we need to reach. And that's the kind of control that I think matters for moral responsibility, maybe also for some other important concepts that might get into some of the moral and political fallout that I teased for later, and that I think we could have even if determinism is true. But on that subject of how all this might relate to some of the moral and political values Aaron and I might actually share, I do have a lot of thoughts about this, but I want to wait on those thoughts until Aaron has had his say. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.